Hermetic human nature, that's our topic. It's an old question, isn't it? What is human nature exactly? There's this old book of definitions of psychology that I used to have, and I really wish I still owned it because it had a really funny definition of human nature in it. It said, human nature is that which we refer to when we want to justify behaviors or attitudes that we don't want to stop doing. I really like that. I think there's a little more to it, but it's a great definition. So what's Hermetic human nature? That's what we're going to talk about now. And to start with, we should say that for Hermeticism, we actually have two natures in one organic package. So our two natures are mortal and immortal. And some of the play of human experience, as well as the conflict and the drama, is in how our mortal and immortal selves get together and how they don't. Two natures rather, mortal and immortal, and also three essences: the intelligible, the animated, and the material, which we could also think of as mind, body, and spirit, and mind, soul, and body. And so as well, the mind, body, spirit goes back pretty far. It too has Hermetic roots. But I want to point out that there is a figure who occasionally pops up in philosophy courses, not often enough, I think. Her name is Asara of Lucania, and she may have had an influence on Plato's idea about this. And her idea was that the self is three interacting basic forces: spirit, mind, and desire. Spirit, mind, and desire. And so this may have influenced Plato, who certainly influenced Freud, id, ego, superego, and all that. In any case, the central fire of all that, the central spark of all that, has to do with nous, which is sometimes mistranslated intellect, but really should be something more like creative consciousness. So in the definitions of Hermes Trismegistus to Asclepius, which is part of the Hermetica, it says, the sight of the body is the eye, but that of the soul is nous. And it also says, whatever the babe in the womb will crave for, so the pregnant woman desires the same. Likewise, whatever nous in the soul will crave for, so will man desire the same. So nous is not only the seat of our creativity, but it's the spark of the sacred that connects us to big mystery itself. And in a way, this has a parallel with Akan philosophy, the philosophy of the people who live in Ghana and the Akan tribe in particular. And one of their ideas is that creativity is something that's fundamental to human beings. It's not an extra capability or something that some of us have and some of us don't. We are by nature creative, and parts of the Hermetica would agree with that too. So one way to come at this is to look at the stories of the origin of humankind, where we came from has a lot to do with who we are. And so just to name one example, or actually two, if we go to the Poem Andres, the first story, in the beginning, big mind, the big mystery, God, what have you, gives birth to something in its own image. Some of this will sound familiar, but this something is a kind of primal form of humanity. It's what Jung would call an archetype, but it's a cosmic one, and it's androgynous, and it lives in the upper world, the superior or intelligible world. And so when this primal being comes into existence, it is reflected or mirrored in the watery nature below. And the water you could think of as mist, or if you're inclined to make a metaphor of science, you might say the plasma at the beginning of the Big Bang. But be that as it may, this primal human, when it sees itself reflected in what will become nature and earth, creates a mortal form after its own likeness. hence us. So we're copies of a copy of the divine in this way of thinking about things. By the way, copies and images are a huge motif in the Gnostic branch of Hermeticism as well. And there's the whole question, which reminds me of so many Hollywood films, especially science fiction. What is the copy and what is the original, and does it matter? And what if the copy evolves beyond the original, and interesting questions like that. So with the creation of the first human being, the sexes are separated. Time starts its course and mortality comes into the picture. And there's a saying from the Gnostic Gospels, which if you think of it culturally and symbolically, rather than literally, has a certain poignancy. The separation of the sexes was the beginning of death. In the Kore Cosmo, the second source I want to mention in this, there's a statement that says, sex is a thing of bodies, not of souls. So in spite of all the gendered male privilege language in the Hermetica as it now stands, especially the Corpus Hermeticum, the nugget idea, the basic essential idea is that sex is fluid, that gender is fluid too. So when all this takes place, God tells the new beings, look down on the earth, which is being formed also. And they agree to take care of the earth, not dominate it. And to provide for everybody who lives there. This too is part of the Kore Cosmo. And so one of the reasons we're here, and this has a root in our nature, is that we're here to appreciate the creation and to look after it, not control it, which is a far smaller agenda and a far less mature one. So the body comes into this too, in the sense that we are embodied spirits and souls from a Hermetic perspective. And in fact, there is a criticism in the Asclepius, otherwise known as the Perfect Discourse, of taking asceticism and denial of the body too far. And so the criticism says that people who do that prefer shadows to reality. And where part of this comes from culturally is the ancient Egyptian traditional revulsion for ascetics who are seen as haters of life, lovers of darkness, anxious to be tortured and martyred, people who, because of their own internal impoverishment, do not love the splendor of the world. They hate it, and they hate themselves, according to this critique anyway. And so what's being advocated here and elsewhere in the Hermetica is more of a middle path, which sounds a little bit like also like Buddhism, and also like the golden mean in Chinese philosophy and practice, the middle path between asceticism and overindulgence. There's also criticisms of simply living for the senses, which psychologically could be thought of as a form of compulsive behavior. In other words, the defense against some kind of wounding. Now, there are some places in the Corpus Hermeticum that talk about separating from the body, but these have to be held in context. What they're referring to is meditation. So in the text, it talks about that and about quieting the senses. And that doesn't mean trying to live apart from the body. It means letting the body be still so that we can focus on what's going on in our consciousness as a temporary practice. So when you read the Corpus Hermetica, that's what it means when you come across it. Now, there's that old question of, is human nature basically good or basically evil? Comes up in all religions and philosophies. Ancient Chinese philosophy goes one way or the other. Mencius says good, Zhongxi says evil. Same disagreements happen in other places. Some people say neutral. Largely though, and I think the Hermetics would agree with humanistic and organismic psychology and existential psychology of our day, it depends on what we do with ourselves. When we are thwarted and injured, especially from very early on, we become evil. And there are people that go through that don't. You can talk to people who've been through cases of just massive child abuse, for instance, or some kind of cult, or injustices in their homeland, massive displacements and things like that. And some people buckle and they just become small or even destructive. And other people somehow thrive. And it doesn't mean they're not injured and that they don't have scars, but it means that they have performed some kind of alchemy where life itself was accepted by them as a healer and teacher. So perhaps what this means is that it's really a matter of choice, not so much in childhood, but we all reach ages where we come to critical decision points in our lives where we can make terrible choices and destructive choices and hurt other people, or we can make good choices that are good for us as well as for other people. And when we consistently make the destructive choices, we get smaller and smaller and become more and more selfish. And you can see this writ large in some public figures, many of whom become politicians and captains of industry and things like that. There's many people in those professions that are not like that too. But the ones that get the most press, I think, the really evil ones, they seem to be people who got injured early on and chose the dark path over and over and over again. So when we're thwarted, we become evil. When we're nurtured, and here comes the figure of Isis in some ways in the Hermetic literature and the Egyptian literature. When we're nurtured and cared for and understood, we usually turn out to be probably what our real human nature actually is. When it's allowed to grow to full stature, we become generous and generative and gregarious and creative and ethical and wise. And that's us at our best. The Hermetica refers to us that way as a magnum miraculum, a great miracle. And that's where our potential lies in terms of our own human nature. So a lot of this is under the condition of choice. So I'll end this by quoting from Shakespeare, who is very influenced by Hermeticism. And, we're all familiar, I think, with his play Hamlet, and to some extent anyway, we've at least heard of it. And there's a part in Hamlet that I suspect, and I haven't done any reading up on this, so I assume that other people have a similar thought about it, some other people, but there's a famous soliloquy where Hamlet criticizes humans. And Hamlet comes from a place of injury and disillusionment. He has seen horrible political actions going on in his country, of which he is part of the nobility, and his own father assassinated, his mother sleeping with the person responsible for the death. So he's really got good reason to be disillusioned. And the question for Hamlet is, what do I do? How is there some way to correct this injustice? And so he is speaking to somebody about how disillusioned he is. And I think what Shakespeare's doing here is, it sounds in a way like a criticism, but not. And I think what he's subtly telling us is that Hamlet knows better deep down, that Hamlet actually has a quite lively sense of how great we can become. But it's framed as a criticism because Hamlet's disillusioned. So even though it's critical, when you really listen into it, it doesn't really come off that way. So I'll just give you that piece. So Hamlet says, ironically, "What a piece of work is man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust?" So the question I would leave you with is, what is it to you?